Grandpa Arthur is such a burden. I can't wait until we can figure out what to do with him." Those words hit me like a sledgehammer as I stood outside my son's kitchen, having come down for a glass of water at midnight. My daughter-in-law was talking to my son Kevin, both of them unaware that I could hear every cruel word. I'm Arthur Mills, 73 years old, and that moment changed everything about how I saw my place in this world. Let me tell you how. I went from being treated like unwanted furniture to discovering that I still had plenty of life, purpose, and dignity left in me. It all started 2 years ago when my wife, Dorothy, passed away from a stroke. We'd been married for 48 years, and her sudden death left me completely lost. Dorothy had been my anchor, my best friend, and the love of my life. When she died, I felt like half of my soul had been ripped away. Kevin, my only child, immediately insisted that I move in with him. His wife, Stephanie, and their 2 teenage children, Madison and Tyler. At first, I was grateful for the invitation. The house Dorothy and I had shared for 30 years felt impossibly empty without her laughter filling the rooms. "Dad, you can't live alone in that big house," Kevin had said after the funeral. "It's not safe for someone your age. Besides, Stephanie and I want to take care of you." Stephanie had nodded and smiled, but even then I noticed the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, Arthur, we're family." So I sold the house that held 40 years of memories, donated most of my furniture, and moved into Kevin and Stephanie's guest bedroom with just a few boxes of personal belongings. I thought I was joining a loving family who wanted me there. Instead, I discovered I was moving into a household where I was seen as an obligation rather than a welcome addition. The signs started small. Stephanie would make dinner for 4 people and then act surprised when I came to the table. "Oh, Arthur, I forgot you were here. Let me see if there's enough food." There was always enough food, but the message was clear. I was an afterthought. When I offered to help with household tasks, she'd refuse in a way that made me feel useless rather than appreciated. No, Arthur, you just relax. You've done enough in your lifetime." But the way she said it suggested that my enough was long over and I had nothing left to contribute. Kevin was gentler but equally dismissive. He'd pat my shoulder and say things like, "Just take it easy, Dad. You've earned your rest." But what he called rest felt more like being put out to pasture. I wasn't being asked to rest from hard work, I was being told that I was no longer capable of meaningful work. The grandchildren, Madison, 16, and Tyler, 14, followed their parents' lead. They were polite but distant, treating me like a piece of antique furniture that had to be carefully worked around. They never asked about my stories, my experiences, or my opinions. When I tried to share tales from my 30 years as a high school history teacher, they'd smile politely and find excuses to leave the room. "Grandpa's going to tell us about the Civil War again," I overheard Madison whisper to Tyler one day, rolling her eyes as if my knowledge was a burden rather than a gift. The isolation was crushing. I spent most days sitting in my small bedroom, or in the corner of the living room, watching television shows I didn't care about while the family lived their lives around me. I felt like a ghost haunting their home, visible but not really present, acknowledged but not valued. MEALTIMES were the worst. Conversation flowed freely between Kevin, Stephanie, and the kids about work, school, friends, and plans. But when I tried to join in, the responses were brief and polite before the conversation moved on without me. It was as if they were humoring an elderly relative who didn't quite understand that his input wasn't needed or wanted. "How was your day, Arthur?" Stephanie would ask, with forced cheerfulness. "Well, I was thinking about that book I read about local history, and I thought maybe Tyler might be interested since he's studying. That's nice, Arthur. Tyler, tell us about your chemistry test. And just like that, I'd be dismissed and forgotten while they discussed things that actually mattered to them. The breaking point came 6 months after I'd moved in. I'd been having trouble sleeping and came downstairs around midnight for a glass of water. That's when I heard Stephanie talking to Kevin in the kitchen. I can't do this anymore, Kevin. Having your father here is suffocating. He's always underfoot, always trying to insert himself into conversations, always needing something. I feel like I'm running a nursing home instead of raising my own family. Stephanie, he's my father. Where else is he going to go? That's exactly my point. We're stuck with him. He's become our full-time responsibility, and honestly, it's affecting our marriage and our kids' home life. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we look into assisted living facilities. Nice ones, obviously, places where he can be around people his own age and get the kind of care he needs without us having to sacrifice our family life. Dad doesn't need that level of care. He's perfectly capable of taking care of himself. Then why is he living here? Kevin, be honest, we took him in because we felt guilty, not because we wanted him here. And now we're all paying the price. The kids can't bring friends over because Grandpa Arthur is always there wanting to chat. I can't relax in my own home because I'm constantly worried about making noise or having to include him in everything we do. I know it's hard, but it's not just hard, Kevin. It's unsustainable. Your father is a burden we can't continue to carry. There was that word, burden. The word that crystallized everything I'd been feeling but hadn't wanted to admit to myself. I stood there in the hallway, my hand gripping the banister to keep from collapsing as my son and daughter-in-law discussed my life as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. But the worst part wasn't hearing them call me a burden. The worst part was hearing Kevin's response. You're right, Stephanie. I'll start looking into options. Maybe we can find somewhere nice, somewhere Dad will be happy. My own son was agreeing to warehouse me because his wife found my presence inconvenient. I crept back upstairs without getting my water, and I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Instead, I lay in that guest bed because it had never become my bed, never become my room, never become my home. And I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to wait for them to dispose of me. I was going to reclaim my life and my dignity on my own terms. The next morning, I called my old friend Robert Chen, a fellow retired teacher who lived across town. Robert and I had taught at the same high school for 20 years, and we'd maintained our friendship even after retirement. Robert, it's Arthur Mills. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Of course, Arthur, what's on your mind? Do you think I'm a burden? Do you find me boring or difficult to be around? Robert was quiet for a moment. Arthur, what brought this on? You're one of the most interesting people I know. Your stories about teaching, your knowledge of local history, your insights about current events. I always enjoy our conversations. Why would you ask such a thing? I told him about my situation with Kevin and Stephanie, about the conversation I'd overheard, about feeling like an unwanted piece of furniture in their home. Arthur, my friend, you're living with the wrong people. Come, have lunch with me today. I want to show you something. That afternoon, Robert took me to the Riverside Community Center, a place I'd never visited before. It was a bustling hub of activity filled with people of all ages, engaged in various programs and activities. Arthur, meet Margaret Williams, Robert said, introducing me to a vibrant woman in her early 70s. Margaret runs the Oral History Project here. Oh, you're Arthur Mills. Margaret's eyes lit up. "Roberts told me about you. You taught high school history for 30 years. We desperately need someone with your experience and knowledge. What kind of oral history project?" "We're documenting the stories of longtime residents, especially focusing on how the community has changed over the decades. We interview people, record their stories, and create digital archives for the local library and historical society. But we need someone who understands how to structure these interviews, how to ask the right questions, how to help people tell their stories effectively." For the first time in months, I felt a spark of interest, of purpose. "Would you like to see what we're working on?" Margaret asked. She led me to a cozy room where several people were engaged in animated conversations. Some were being interviewed, others were doing the interviewing, and still others were working on computers, transcribing and organizing the recorded stories. "Mrs. Patterson here is telling us about what downtown looked like in the 1960s. Margaret explained, gesturing to an elderly woman who was showing old photographs to a young man with a recording device. "And Mr. Gonzalez is sharing his experiences. As one of the first Latino teachers in the district, I watched, fascinated, as stories came alive through these conversations. These weren't just random reminiscences, they were structured, thoughtful explorations of how individual experiences connected to larger historical patterns. This is exactly the kind of project I used to do with my students," I told Margaret, "connecting personal stories to historical context, helping people understand how their individual experiences fit into the bigger picture. Would you be interested in helping us? We meet 3 times a week, and we're always looking for volunteers who can help train our interviewers and guide our documentation efforts." I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Excitement about a project, anticipation about contributing, something meaningful. I'd love to help. That was the beginning of my transformation. I started volunteering at the Riverside Community Center the following week. And for the first time since Dorothy's death, I felt useful again. Margaret paired me with Sarah, a recent college graduate who was coordinating the oral history project, and together we developed new interview protocols and training materials for volunteers. "Arthur, your background in education is exactly what we needed," Sarah told me after our first week working together. "You know how to structure learning experiences, how to ask questions that get people thinking, how to help them connect their personal experiences to broader themes." The work was intellectually stimulating in a way I hadn't experienced since retirement. Each interview presented new challenges. How do you help someone who's never thought of themselves as having an interesting story realize that their experiences are valuable? How do you structure questions to elicit specific details without making the conversation feel like an interrogation? How do you create an archive that will be useful to future researchers while remaining accessible to community members? But beyond the intellectual satisfaction, the work provided something even more valuable: a sense of belonging and purpose. The people at the community center didn't see me as a burden or an obligation. They saw me as a resource, a contributor, someone with valuable skills and knowledge to offer. When I spoke, people listened because they valued my input. When I shared stories from my teaching career, people asked follow-up questions because they were genuinely interested. "Arthur, could you help train our new volunteers?" Margaret asked after I'd been volunteering for a month. "You have such a gift for explaining interviewing techniques and helping people feel comfortable." Soon I was leading training sessions for new oral history volunteers, teaching them how to prepare for interviews, how to create safe spaces for storytelling, and how to ask questions that would elicit rich, detailed narratives. The training sessions reminded me of why I'd loved teaching. There's something magical about watching people develop new skills, about seeing them gain confidence in their abilities, about witnessing those aha moments when concepts click into place. Mr. Mills, I never thought I could do interviews, one volunteer told me after her first successful recording session. But your training helped me understand that it's really about listening and caring about people's stories. 3 months into my volunteer work, something unexpected happened. Sarah approached me with a proposal that would change my living situation entirely. Arthur, I've been thinking. You spend so much time here at the community center, and you're such an integral part of our team. Have you ever considered moving closer to downtown? The community center was indeed a 40-minute drive from Kevin and Stephanie's house, and I'd been relying on rides from Robert or taking expensive taxi rides several times a week. I've been thinking about it, but I'm not sure where I'd live. Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. My grandmother just moved to Florida, and she's looking for someone to rent her apartment. It's a beautiful one-bedroom place, just 6 blocks from here, in a really walkable neighborhood with shops and restaurants and the library. Would you be interested in seeing it? The apartment was perfect. It was on the 2nd floor of a well-maintained building, with large windows that filled the space with natural light. The bedroom was cozy but sufficient, and the living room was large enough for my books and a comfortable reading chair. Best of all, everything I needed was within walking distance. The community center, the grocery store, the library, several restaurants, and a small park where I could take morning walks. The rent is very reasonable. Sarah's grandmother, Mrs. Chen, no relation to Robert, explained. I'm more interested in finding a responsible tenant who'll take care of the place than in making money. For the first time since Dorothy's death, I could envision a life that was mine, not a guest room in someone else's house, but a space where I belonged, where I could make my own decisions about how to spend my time and energy. But I knew that moving out would require a difficult conversation with Kevin and Stephanie. I chose a Sunday morning when the kids were sleeping late and Kevin and Stephanie were having coffee in the kitchen. I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say, but I was still nervous about their reaction. Kevin, Stephanie, I need to talk to you about something important. They looked up from their newspapers with expressions that suggested they were preparing for me to make some kind of demand or request. I've decided to move out. I've found an apartment downtown, near the community center where I've been volunteering. The silence that followed was telling. Instead of protest or concern, I saw relief flash across both their faces before they quickly rearranged their expressions into more appropriate responses. Dad, are you sure that's a good idea? Kevin asked. Living alone at your age? I'm 73, Kevin, not 93. I'm perfectly capable of living independently. But what if something happens? What if you fall or have a medical emergency? The same thing that would happen if I lived here. I'd call for help. The difference is that downtown I'll be surrounded by neighbors and friends who actually want me around. Stephanie tried to look concerned. Arthur, we want you to be happy, but we worry about you being isolated. I almost laughed at the irony. Stephanie, I've been more isolated living here than I've ever been in my life. At least in my own apartment, I won't have to pretend that anyone wants me around. That comment hit home, and I could see both of them realize that I'd heard more of their conversations than they'd thought. Dad, Kevin said quietly, if you've heard us talking, I heard enough to know that you consider me a burden. And you know what? I don't blame you. I've been acting like one. That's not true, Dad. It is true, Kevin. I moved in here expecting you to provide me with purpose and meaning and social connection. That was unfair to you and your family. It's not your job to make me happy or give my life meaning. That's my job. The conversation continued for another hour, with Kevin expressing genuine concern about my safety and well-being, and Stephanie trying to convince me that I was welcome in their home. But I could tell that underneath their polite protests, they were relieved that I was taking the initiative to solve the Arthur problem myself. "If this is what you really want, Dad, then we support you," Kevin finally said, "but promise me you'll call if you need anything." "I promise, and I want you to know that I don't blame you for feeling burdened by me. I came here grieving and lost, and I expected you to fix that for me. That wasn't fair." 2 weeks later, I moved into my downtown apartment with help from Robert and some of my new friends from the community center. For the first time in almost a year, I was arranging my own furniture in my own space, making my own decisions about how to organize my life. The transformation was immediate and profound. Instead of spending my days waiting for someone to include me in their activities, I was actively engaged in meaningful work. Instead of feeling like an unwanted guest, I was a valued member of a community that appreciated my contributions, but my daily routine became structured around purpose rather than boredom. I'd wake up early and take a walk through the neighborhood, often stopping to chat with shopkeepers who got to know me as a regular customer rather than someone's elderly relative. I'd spend mornings working on oral history projects, afternoons training new volunteers or conducting interviews, and evenings reading or attending community events. The Oral History Project grew under my involvement, and within 6 months, we'd documented over 100 stories from community members. The local newspaper wrote an article about our work, highlighting how the project was preserving important community memories, while providing meaningful engagement opportunities for people of all ages. Arthur Mills has brought a level of professionalism and educational expertise to our oral history project that has transformed it from a small volunteer effort into a significant community resource. Margaret was quoted as saying in the article, "Reading those words, I felt a pride and sense of accomplishment that I hadn't experienced since my teaching days. But the most surprising development was the social connections that began forming naturally around my new life, because I was genuinely engaged in meaningful work, because I had interesting projects to discuss and stories to share. People sought out my company rather than tolerating it. Robert and I started having weekly dinners at a local restaurant where we'd discuss our respective volunteer work and debate current events. Margaret introduced me to her book club, where my background in history and education made me a valued contributor to discussions. Sarah and I became genuine friends, despite our age difference, bonded by our shared passion for preserving community stories. Most unexpectedly, I met Dolores Reyes, a 69-year-old retired librarian who was volunteering on a literacy project at the community center. Dolores was smart, funny, and shared my love of books and learning. Our friendship developed slowly, built on mutual respect and common interests, rather than loneliness or convenience. "Arthur, you're not like most men your age," Dolores told me one evening as we walked through the park after a community center event. "What do you mean? You're still curious about the world, still learning new things, still contributing something meaningful. Most men I meet have given up, decided their productive years are behind them. But you act like you're just getting started." She was right. For the first time since Dorothy's death, I felt like I was building toward something, rather than winding down from something. 6 months after moving into my apartment, I got an unexpected phone call from Kevin. "Dad, I was wondering if we could have lunch sometime, just the two of us." We met at a restaurant downtown, near my apartment. Kevin looked uncomfortable, like he had something difficult to say. Dad, I owe you an apology. For what? For treating you like a problem to be managed instead of my father. For letting Stephanie's attitude toward you influence how I treated you. For making you feel unwelcome in our home. I was surprised by his directness and apparent sincerity. Kevin, you were dealing with a difficult situation. I understand that having me in your house was disruptive. That's not an excuse, Dad. The truth is, I was so focused on what I thought you needed a place to live. Someone to take care of you, that I never asked what you actually wanted. I assumed that because you were widowed and older, you must want to be taken care of. I never considered that what you might want was to be useful and engaged. I didn't know what I wanted either, son. I was lost after your mother died. But you figured it out. You found your own way, and honestly, Dad, seeing you now compared to how you were when you lived with us, it's like you're a completely different person. He was right. I was a different person. I was the person I'd been before Dorothy died, before I'd allowed grief and loneliness to convince me that my productive years were over. Your mother always said that the secret to aging well was to keep growing, keep contributing, keep learning. I told Kevin. I forgot that for a while. Dad, would you be willing to have dinner with our family sometime? I'd like Madison and Tyler to get to know their grandfather better. The real you, not the sad, lost version they met last year. I agreed, and the dinner a few weeks later was a revelation. Instead of sitting quietly while the family talked around me, I came as someone with interesting stories to share about my work. Fascinating people I'd met through the Oral History Project, and insights about community issues I'd learned through my volunteer work. Madison, it turned out, was interested in journalism and was fascinated by the interviewing techniques I'd developed. Tyler was working on a history project for school and was eager to hear my stories about teaching and local history. Grandpa, I had no idea you were working on such cool projects, Madison said. Could I maybe interview you for my school newspaper about the oral history work you're doing? And could you help me with my history project? Tyler asked. I'm supposed to interview someone who remembers how the town has changed, and you probably know more about that than anyone. For the first time since moving in with them, my grandchildren saw me as a resource rather than a relic. Someone who could help them rather than someone they had to help. Stephanie was different too. More genuine in her interactions with me. Without the daily stress of feeling responsible for my happiness and engagement, she could appreciate me as a person rather than resenting me as an obligation. Arthur, I owe you an apology too, she said as we cleaned up after dinner. I handled your living with us very poorly. I made you feel unwelcome in our home, and that was wrong. Stephanie, it was a difficult situation for everyone. Maybe, but that doesn't excuse how I treated you. You're a remarkable man with a lot to offer, and I was too focused on my own inconvenience to see that. Today, almost 2 years after moving into my downtown apartment, my life looks nothing like what I expected when Dorothy died. Instead of declining into irrelevance and dependence, I've discovered new purposes, new friendships, and new reasons to be excited about the future. The Oral History Project has expanded into a partnership with the local historical society and the university, creating a permanent archive of community stories that will preserve local history for future generations. I've been asked to serve on the board of directors for the Historical Society, bringing my educational background to help guide their programming and outreach efforts. My relationship with Kevin's family has stabilized into something healthier and more authentic. We have dinner together monthly, and I've become a genuine resource for Madison and Tyler rather than an obligation they have to manage. Kevin and I meet for lunch regularly, and our conversations are now between equals rather than between a caregiver and his elderly dependent. Dolores and I have developed a deep friendship that's become one of the most important relationships in my life. We travel together occasionally, attend cultural events, and support each other through the challenges that come with aging. Our relationship is built on mutual respect and shared interests, rather than need or convenience. But perhaps most importantly, I've learned that dignity isn't something that others give you or take away from you. Dignity is something you claim for yourself through your choices, your actions, and your refusal to accept other people's diminished expectations of your worth. When I was living with Kevin and Stephanie, I had allowed their view of me as a burden to become my own self-perception. I had accepted their belief that my productive years were over, that my primary role was to be cared for rather than to care for others, that my stories and knowledge were relics rather than resources. But moving out and reclaiming my independence taught me that aging doesn't have to mean declining into irrelevance. It can mean transitioning into new forms of contribution, new types of relationships, new ways of being useful and engaged in the world. The community center recently honored me with a volunteer service award, recognizing my contributions to the Oral History Project and my work training other volunteers. As I stood at the podium accepting the award, looking out at a room full of people who valued my work and appreciated my presence, I thought about how different my life might have been if I'd stayed in that guest bedroom, waiting for other people to give my life meaning. Arthur Mills has shown us that retirement doesn't have to mean withdrawal, Margaret said in her introduction. He's demonstrated that experience, knowledge, and wisdom are resources to be shared, not burdens to be managed. Those words meant more to me than any recognition I'd received during my teaching career, because they represented a fundamental shift in how I was seen and how I saw myself. I'm no longer someone who needs to be taken care of. I'm someone who takes care of others, who contributes to my community, who solves problems rather than creating them. The guest bedroom I used to occupy at Kevin and Stephanie's house has been converted into a home office for Stephanie's consulting business. When Kevin told me about the renovation, I felt no sadness or regret. That room had never been my home. It had been a temporary shelter while I figured out how to live again. My real home is this apartment where I make my own decisions, pursue my own interests, and build relationships based on mutual respect rather than familial obligation. My real family includes not just Kevin and his children, but also the community of friends and colleagues who value me for who I am today rather than tolerating me because of who I used to be. Sometimes being called a burden is the wake-up call. You need to stop acting like one. Sometimes the best response to being unwanted is to make yourself indispensable somewhere else. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to stop expecting them to provide what you need to provide for yourself. I'm 75 now, and instead of feeling like my best years are behind me, I feel like I'm just hitting my stride. There are stories to collect, volunteers to train, friends to make, and contributions to offer. There's dignity to maintain and purposes to pursue. And there's absolutely no time to sit around feeling sorry for myself or waiting for someone else to make my life meaningful. Have you ever felt like a burden to your family? Do you know an elderly person who might be struggling with feeling unwanted or useless? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes, the greatest gift we can give someone is helping them rediscover their own worth and potential. If this story inspired you to think about aging, dignity, and purpose differently, please subscribe for more stories about resilience, community, and finding meaning at every stage of life. From what city are you joining us today?